The second place is evil because it undermines the Federal Reserve System and the national currency system, which we desperately need to maintain its integrity and government control and so on.
Brian, may I play devil's advocate for a moment?
Sure.
And when I say devil's advocate, what I mean is I'm going to assume the role of Warren Buffett and his late investing partner, Charlie Munger. And Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger make the point often that you can't use this stuff, you can't use Bitcoin in transactions. And I even, a moment ago, I quoted a piece by Mark Andreessen, one of your board members. Mark Andreessen wrote, critics point to limited usage by ordinary consumers and merchants, but that criticism was leveled against PCs and the internet at the same stage. Every day, more and more consumers and merchants are buying, using, and selling Bitcoin. Mark Andreessen wrote that 10 years ago, and transactions are still at a very, very low level. How come?
Well, I'd say it's actually grown a lot since 2014, if that's when it was written, I think. But at that time, there was probably only maybe single-digit millions of Americans who had used crypto at that time. There's now about 52 million, and so, by the way, globally, I think it's probably about 400 million or so people have used it. So, oftentimes people go through. I think partly that criticism is correct. By the way,
you can't buy. Nobody pays for groceries with crypto or tanks up with crypto, right? Okay.
Yeah, so everyday items, especially kind of in retail merchants in the United States, they're not going to be the earliest adopters of this. The more early adopters of it are people, it's basically digital payments, so online, and then it's in emerging markets. And I will say, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I actually would have thought we had made more progress to now. So
you would have expected more.
Yeah,
you and Mark Andreessen were together.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And I can talk a little bit about why I think that is. But still, I don't want to fully acknowledge the point that it's very small, because I think getting 400 million people in the world to use anything is actually like a really great step if you zoom out 10 years and look at the trajectory of the internet kind of through the 80s and 90s. And so people start often using crypto. They want to buy a piece of it to sort of, hey, this is interesting. I might want to own a piece of the future. It's a little bit like when domain names first came out on the internet, and people
buy
like
them up for fun.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe this will be valuable someday.
Right.
That was kind of the early days. It's often still how people get their feet wet. Then we saw people start to use crypto for payments, and especially with U.S. dollar-backed stablecoins and what's called layer 2, which is allowing payments to be faster and cheaper. We've started to see actually quite a bit more activity in the payment space, especially in emerging markets, which I can talk about if you want. And then more recently, we've seen people start to use crypto for a few things. One of them is called NFTs, which is essentially artists who are trying to publish their work in a digital way that they can have a relationship with their fans directly for monetization. Things like decentralized social media have just gotten started, where it's censorship resistant, so you're not going to get censored by big tech or something, but it's also a way where you can actually monetize social media, and so directly, and not have ads put on top of it by the platform. So anyway, there's a lot of utility that we can talk about that's emerging. I think if you make an analogy to the internet had to do a few things. First, people don't remember this. The internet started off with just IP addresses, and those are kind of machine readable, but they're not human readable. So we needed domain names to translate to IP addresses to get that to be kind of human readable, and email addresses and things like that we could remember, not just a series of numbers. Crypto again started off with something kind of like IP addresses, like Bitcoin addresses just look like a random string of characters. We now have things that are more human readable, and I can talk about what some of those are. So we had to make the names and addresses human readable. The second thing we had to do was actually get it to be more scalable. So the internet, remember, it kind of went through dial-up to broadband.
Right.
And you could load like a page of text or something on dial-up, but on broadband you could start to have more interactive applications. Crypto is going through its own kind of dial-up to broadband moment, which is in crypto it's called going from layer 1 to layer 2. And then the other big thing that needed to get the internet to broad adoption was the web browser, right? Average people, they didn't really want to be on a command line, typing in commands. Once there was a web browser, anybody could use it. They didn't know underneath they were using these internet protocols like HTTP and SMTP, but they didn't know that. They just want to click the link. And so there was this moment with Netscape and the early browsers that kind of opened up the aperture of how many people could use the internet without even caring about the underlying technology. And so crypto is, I think it's yet to maybe have that moment where how do we make this easy and accessible to a broad range of people? And that's part of what Coinbase is trying to do with our self-custodial wallet, which I can talk about if you want. But anyway, I think those three pieces are going to probably, when we look back on crypto in 5-10 years, we'll say those were kind of similar moments that led to, okay, eventually we got to a couple billion people using it every day.
Okay. Thank you. And now that was Warren Buffett. Now a couple seconds of Charlie Munger, his late investment partner.
But I don't know if that answer would have helped Warren Buffett. But I mean, I think his point of view may actually. I haven't met him personally, but I think his point of view might be a little bit more like the dollar is king. And
here's Charlie Munger.
The second place is evil because it undermines the Federal Reserve System and the national currency system, which we desperately need to maintain its integrity and government control and so on.
Okay, so that's a serious accusation. That's not just this thing isn't useful. Charlie Munger says, the late Charlie Munger says, that as crypto grows, more people hold crypto, fewer people hold dollars. That limits the ability of the Federal Reserve to control the currency, manage the economy, keep employment up, keep inflation down, all of that. And so what you're doing, as I understand Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, their ordinary view would be, oh, what the heck, let Brian Armstrong play with Coinbase and see what emerges. That's the way the economy works. We take bets on things. We see what happens. But you're posing a threat to the currency of the United States. And he even goes as far as to call it evil. How do you answer that one?
So I think this is actually the crux of the argument, and this is where people's views may diverge. But here, I'll give you my perspective on it. So I think that one of the most patriotic things you can do for America to ensure that Western civilization continues to flourish and the dollar remains relevant and everything is to have a check and balance on deficit spending and high inflation. In 1971, we kind of went fully off the gold standard with Nixon. And because the dollar was no longer backed by any hard commodity, it allowed essentially unlimited inflation of the money supply. And since then, I think America has started to see challenges, right? There's actually a really great website. I think it's called WTF Happened in 1971. It just shows a whole bunch of charts that happened at that time. And
the troubles that started when we decoupled from gold.
Right.
All right.
And so, I'm a U.S. patriot. I think that America is a great country. I chose to build, Coinbase here in this country. I think that if we don't have a check and balance on the dollar, there is not a incentive. Basically, the incentive is for the supply to just be inflated away. And you can look at the history of this. Ray Dalio has a great book on this. But essentially, great empires fall when they lose the financial discipline with the currency, and they lose the reserve currency status. And so,
Brian, could I?
Yeah.
I was thinking about Charlie because when he said crypto is evil, I thought, where does that even come from? Well, he died last year at the age of 99, and what that means is that he was an old enough man so that a formative experience in his life was the Depression, the Great Depression, and like a lot of people, I'm doing this because my parents, a lot of people who grew up during that period, the government in one way or another was important in getting us out of it. And in one way or another, the feds, the Federal Reserve, the banking system finally figured out what to do so that we don't have to go through that again. I just wonder, whereas if you take, we're recording this at Stanford University, you take the kids around here, since Joe Biden became president, inflation's eroded 20% of the value of the dollar. In other words, if you're a younger person and you watch this happen, you don't think the Fed is that great in the first place. Is there some generational problem here?
Yeah. I mean, I think that you can look at it in the data. There's all these polls that show like a loss of trust in our major institutions. But I think you're right. Like a well-run Fed could actually manage the shocks in the system and the ups and the downs. And it's not just the Fed, by the way. I think, they've done actually a reasonable job, all things considered. It's also just the way the incentives are set up in Congress, right? There's really no party right now that wants to pass a balanced budget. And so this is not just unique to America, by the way. It's true of every great empire. If you go back and look at the British and the Dutch and China, et cetera, once you have the reserve currency status, your temptation is to abuse it and to inflate. And eventually you go too far and you lose trust in the system. And so I think there needs to be an alternative, and people are kind of waking up to that Bitcoin is provably scarce. You don't have to trust the good intentions of man or mankind or women or anything. You're trusting the laws of math, right? They're unbreakable in that sense. And so it always kind of felt a little bit odd to me, or just it didn't feel right that there was a very small number of people with their fingers on the dials of changing interest rates or the money supply writ large. And it's like the ring of power. There's the potential for abuse is too tempting. And
we're all human after all. Even Jerome Powell is human after all.
Yeah, and it's not just him. I think he's a reasonable person. But it's the system, and the incentives are set up wrong.
Right.
And Argentina is just 100 years further on this history, but you can see that America is still, I think, the strongest country in the world, and it's the best place to do business and everything. And I think there's nowhere else I'd rather be. But you can see some of the strain on the system. And I do think that the best way to ensure the survival of the dollar and making sure that's a source of soft power for the U.S. We need a digitized dollar. The way to ensure the survival of America is to ensure that the currency is strong and we continue this American experiment. I actually think Bitcoin and crypto is really essential to that.